Richard Feynman warned in his 1974 Caltech speech that the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Feynman pointed out the dangers of simply repeating the same experimental methods when the variables were not properly controlled, as it leads to repeated misinterpretation of the results. Here he describes how one of the most important rat experiments of all time has been ignored by other researchers in their studies.
But in 1937, a man named Young did a very interesting one. He had a long corridor with doors all along one side where the rats came in, and doors along the other side where the food was. He wanted to see if he could train the rats to go in at the third door down from wherever he started them off. No. The rats went immediately to the door where the food had been the time before. The question was, how did the rats know? Because the corridor was so beautifully built and so uniform that this was the same door as before. Obviously, there was something about the door that was different from the other doors, so he painted the doors very carefully, arranging the textures on the faces of the doors exactly the same. Still, the rats could tell. Then he thought maybe the rats were smelling the food. So he used chemicals to change the smell after each run. Still, the rats could tell. Then he realized the rats might be able to tell by seeing the lights and the arrangement in the laboratory like any common-sense person. So he covered the corridor. And still, the rats could tell. He finally found that they could tell by the way the floor sounded when they ran over it. And he could only fix that by putting his corridor in sand. So he covered one after another of all possible clues, and finally was able to fool the rats so that they had to learn to go in the third door. If he relaxed any of his condition, the rats could tell. Now, from a scientific standpoint, that is a number one experiment. That is the experiment that makes rat running experiments sensible, because it uncovers the clues that the rat is really using, not what you think it's using. And that is the experiment that tells exactly what conditions you have to use in order to be careful and control everything in an experiment with rat running. I looked into the subsequent history of this research. The next experiment, and the one after that, never referred to Mr. Young. They never used any of his criteria of putting the corridor on sand or being very careful. They just went right on running rats in the same old way, and paid no attention to the great discoveries of Mr. Young, and his papers are not referred to, because he didn't discover anything about the rats. In fact, he discovered all the things you have to do to discover something about rats, but not paying attention to experiments like that is a characteristic of cargo cult science.